Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today to learn some more about corrections processing best practices, really just reducing tax form before and after filing. I am Lauren Skinner-Johnson with Convey Compliance, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I just want to cover a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all participants will be on mute throughout the entire event. So if you do have questions, please do submit them through the chat window or through the Q&A window by selecting the top of your screen and just selecting the chat window or the Q&A box, and you can type your question right in there. And then we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Before I hand it off to Neil, we do want to get a better understanding of how concerned you are about corrections processing within your organization. So I'm going to launch a poll question. And the question is, what is your biggest concern as it relates to corrections processing? A, opportunity cost, B, direct cost, C, IRS penalties, D, brand or customer issues, E, other, or F, I don't know. We'll give you just a brief moment to answer those questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Neil Lefevre, who's Product Manager with Convey.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So today we'll be covering a few different topics. We'll basically be starting by just doing kind of an overview of corrections processing. And then kind of the majority of the presentation will be around a few best practices, and it's kind of broken down into three different sections. The first being just some thoughts and ideas around how you handle the correction processing within your organization, which is kind of a reactive process. And then the next two sections will be about kind of taking a more proactive approach to corrections processing, which are going to be a few ideas on how to minimize some of the calls that come into your organization, and then reducing the overall amount of corrections that you have to process. So just to kind of get us started and get us all on the same page, just a quick overview of corrections processing. So at the end of January, we have to print and mail our forms and deliver those. And I know there's a few other dates depending on form types, but for the most part, the majority of forms are due at the end of January. Then kind of the next step in the process is something that we at Convey call revising statements. And there's a difference between revised statements and corrected statements, and we'll talk about that in a second. So kind of the next date in the process is IRS filing. And IRS filing occurs at the end of March is kind of the standard date when you have to file your forms. And everything after your IRS filing is considered an IRS correction. So the reason I want to make the distinction between correction and revised statement is because corrections in the IRS eyes have penalties associated with them. Revised statements don't have penalties. So a huge difference. And what you can do to kind of help put yourself in a better position to do less corrections is file what's called an IRS extension of time. And what that does is it extends the date of the date when you need to send your transmittal to the IRS from the end of March, and gives you until the end of April to file your tax forms with the IRS. So after you do your filing with the IRS, any change you make is going to potentially be a correction penalty for a late original or a corrected form. And also any name and TIN that you submit in your transmittal that's incorrect is going to equate to a B notice in the fall. So it's really kind of, you know, only going to lead to your advantage to file that extension. Give yourself an extra 30 days to make as many changes to your statements, to make as many revised statements as you can, so that you can avoid filing corrections with the IRS. So you're going to cut down a lot on penalties and B notices coming this fall. So now that we're kind of all on the same page on kind of what a correction is and what a revised statement is, kind of why does all this matter? Well, as most of you indicated in your poll, it's pretty obvious that penalties and costs are the biggest reason why this matters to folks. There's hard costs associated with processing corrections, as well as and that's from penalties, but beyond that, it's also the opportunity cost associated with doing corrections. If you do it right the first time, you can move on and keep doing things that are more core to your business, more revenue generating. Every time you have to do a correction, you're essentially doing something twice, and there's a huge opportunity cost associated with that. And then next, and this is kind of related to cost, but print and mail costs are huge. Actually, besides people, the actual print and mail costs that are associated with this process are extensive, and if you have to do a lot of corrections, you're paying for that postage multiple times.
We're just going to take a quick minute. Our slideshow seems to be advancing before we're liking it to, so give us just a quick minute, and we're going to show it to you a different way. And we are back.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so just to kind of recap, the first item was cost and correction processing, as well as opportunity cost. The second item was print and mail costs. Kind of third big item here is customer service. So a lot goes into correction processing as it relates to customer service, especially for larger organizations out there. You have, in some cases, lots of individuals taking calls, handling corrections and reprints. And if you're a very large organization, in a lot of cases, and you're filing a lot of 1099s, you might actually have to bring in temps to handle the volume of calls at the end of January, in February, and in March. So again, kind of huge cost related to customer service. You have to train all these folks, especially if they're only temps. It's kind of, you know, money that's not really benefiting your organization very much. And then lastly, and I think this gets overlooked a lot, is brand. There's definitely a brand impact when you're dealing with a lot of corrections. So forms go out the door to individuals. If that form is incorrect, the name or TIN is wrong, the dollars are wrong, they now have to stop doing their taxes in a lot of cases, give you a call, go through a change process, and in some cases they're not going to be very happy. So as much as you can minimize the corrections that are occurring, it's going to just make your organization look that much better, especially as it compares to other organizations out there. So we kind of started talking a lot about IRS penalties. It was obviously a big concern for folks on this webinar. Looking at the results, IRS penalties were about 90% of folks' concern. And as most of you are aware, but I just like to reiterate it, penalties for late filings and incorrect filings have doubled, and they are essentially twice as much as they previously were. So it's important to reduce the overall amount of corrections that you're processing so you can keep those penalties down. And if your penalties are increasing year over year, you're going to be hit with a pretty severe penalty this year and moving forward as they have doubled. Okay, so let's spend a couple minutes talking about the corrections process and some ways you may improve upon that process. So the first area I'd like to cover is as it relates to customer service representatives or CSRs. This is a huge cost, especially if you're a larger organization. You have to spend a lot of time training reps, bringing reps up to speed. And what you should really consider is how can you make their time most effective, and it's spending time with the supervisors of the customer service groups, the supervisors of or managers of the call center, and really making sure that they're as prepared for the season as they can be, especially if they are answering kind of more in-depth calls as it relates to things like, you know, if there's new forms that they may be taking calls about, new fields or new rules. If they're taking kind of the more advanced level calls, you want to make sure they're trained, there's processes and procedures set up and that are run through well before the season hits. Another thing that you should consider is if you have an IVR system in place, making sure you're reviewing that IVR system. So kind of press 1 for questions, 2 for reprints, going through those steps and kind of making sure that they're optimized so that if folks do have questions or concerns about their forms, they're able to get to a customer service rep efficiently and as quickly as possible. And then another thing you want to make sure that's very clear from a customer servicing standpoint is when changes need to happen, how are those changes being managed by the customer service reps? Are they able to make some of the changes to the forms themselves, or do they have to route those changes to the back office or to the tax group within your organization? So making sure that that process is as streamlined as possible. We work with a lot of organizations who it's kind of a rough process. They may use things like Post-it notes or emails to actually make change requests to certain forms. And that's not a very efficient process. So one thing that you definitely want to make sure that you have in place is the right set of tools for folks that are handling calls. And some kind of things that you want to consider are, do the people that are answering calls and talking to clients, do they have access to all the information that they need? In a lot of organizations, customer service reps could handle more calls and deal with more first-level issues, but they can't because they simply don't have access to the data. And in a lot of cases, they don't have access to the data because the tools that are in place for them aren't very efficient. They're older tools. So looking at what you're actually deploying to your customer service reps and seeing if you can either enhance those tools or provide a new tool set which will give them access to view the data, to do things like reprints, or to efficiently and properly process corrections. And then it kind of goes beyond service reps. And when you're actually talking about the tax department, what tools are in place for yourselves, for your team members, and other folks that have access to the tax information? Is it very easy and efficient to do things like prior year changes? A lot of organizations, again, that's kind of an issue. They may have a system to make corrections, but it only works for current year. So there's a lot of kind of workarounds and In some cases, you may even have to purchase a secondary tool or system to manage prior year corrections or other form types. A lot of folks, for example, 1042S, their core system can't handle 1042S, so they have to purchase a secondary tool to manage 1042S forms and corrections. Or their main system handles, their main form volume processing, but it can't even handle corrections. So again, you're purchasing a second tool. View the tax information, but process changes correctly. And then finally, if you are allowing kind of more temporary or customer service type individuals to make corrections, how is the follow-up happening to your clients to ensure that the change is taking place and that it's kind of a closed loop system? So what we recommend is having a change control workflow or process set up so that you're not using things like post-it notes and emails. You actually have a way to systematically make a change request to a form. Someone in the tax department can review and either approve or reject that change request. And then if it's approved or rejected or if there's more information needed, the customer service agent or someone within the tax group can follow up with the individual making the request and let them know that, hey, we've made this adjustment, you can expect your new form in the mail in the next couple days. So really having a closed loop system to process those changes and corrections fast and efficiently. So that was a couple points as it relates to dealing with corrections as they're coming into your call center or your tax department. But what we really at Convey like to focus on are how can we be proactive, and instead of figuring out better ways to deal with corrections, which you still want to do, but it's also how can you get proactive and kind of take advantage of some new thinking around 1099s and really reduce or minimize the amount of calls coming into your call center or tax group and minimize the corrections that you actually have to process. So one great way to reduce the amount of calls that are coming in to your tax department or your call center is to provide additional information. We find that a lot of times calls are generated just because individuals, maybe they've never received a form from you or your organization, or a form has changed and they have questions about a new box or about some of the payments. So one great way to really streamline the amount of calls coming into your system and minimize them is to provide additional information. And a great way to do that, and a cost-effective way to do that, is with form inserts. So when you actually mail your 1099s, instead of just mailing a form and hoping for the best, create an FAQ document or a cover letter that you actually include with the 1099. It could be a full sheet like we have shown here, or it could be maybe a half sheet or even what they call a buck slip, which kind of looks like a dollar bill with some information. It's a great way to really minimize the amount of calls that are coming in, especially if the reason people are calling, if you're documenting those reasons and you know the top 5 or 10 reasons, throw it in a document and include that information along with your 1099s. Another great way is providing or adding print notes to your tax statements. Perfectly within the IRS rules to include some additional language on your 1099 forms. First and foremost, you should include a nice phone number so that if people do have questions, they know exactly how to reach you. It's especially efficient if this phone number is dynamic. It's not just one general number, but maybe it gets you to the specific person or individual in your group who can help, or a specific business unit where the form came from, so that they don't have to bounce around an IVR system. And what a lot of folks are also doing now is they're including not only a phone number but a web address. So they kind of, maybe they don't want to incur the cost of including a paper insert with FAQs on it, but they'll do a digital version. And then on their tax forms, they'll just indicate, go to mycompany.com/1099s, and they can actually go to the website. Again, it's pretty much basically free to include a web address on your form. and then it's extremely cheap just to throw something up on your website. Great way to reduce the amount of calls, and a lot of folks are really wanting self-serve options. So if you put FAQs and additional information on your website and provide an alternative to a phone number, a lot of folks will go that route, and you can avoid incurring those calls. Next, transaction printing. So again, providing additional information on the form is a great way to reduce calls. A lot of times, people are getting calls and they're not necessarily related to corrections. It's just questions about the form. And a lot of times they result in no correction actually being made. It's just providing answers to the questions that are being asked. So if you include additional information on the bottom of the form, maybe if your form has payments from multiple areas within your organization or multiple business units, and you're rolling that up on a 1099, if you provide a breakdown of where those payments came from or the product that it applies to, again, a great way to reduce phone calls coming into your call center. And also you can, in some cases, put multiple phone numbers on your form. So if they have a question about one specific payment, it'll take them, the phone number will take them to that business unit. And if they have a question about a different payment, you can actually have them call a number which gets them directly to that business unit. So a great way to kind of streamline that customer workflow within your organization. Another great way to kind of reduce those calls coming in is verifying and updating your IVR system. So when folks do call up and they do get that press 1 for questions, 2 for reprints, what we're seeing some folks do is actually put an electronic option for people to request reprints. A lot of times folks call and they just need another copy of the form, they lost it, whatever the case may be. You can actually integrate your IVR system to do electronic reprints and kind of avoid having that customer get to a customer service agent altogether. Another thing that we're seeing folks do is maybe you do have an FAQ or additional information on your website. If instead of using hold music while they're waiting to talk to somebody, you can actually insert language in a lot of cases into that hold music so that you're actually directing them for, reprints, go on our website and you can print your form there, or questions, go to this web address, and you, in a lot of cases, can get a lot of people to drop out of the queue without ever having to reach an individual. And then kind of lastly in this section is eStatements. So again, a great way to avoid calls coming in is to put the forms, your 1099 forms, up on your website. A lot of calls come in just for reprints, so if you put those forms on your website, not only do you save a call coming into your call center, but you also save on that print and mail cost. So a great way to reduce that overall cost. And then kind of final section for today is reducing the amount of correction. So really, what can you do before you get to the correction process to kind of eliminate issues and mistakes before they actually get printed on a form and sent out to your recipients? First thing you want to make sure you're doing is your 1099 system should be validating all the data that's coming in for common IRS errors and issues. So it should be doing things like checking the city-state zip combinations to make sure the form can be delivered. It should be making sure that withholding dollars aren't greater than payment amounts on forms. All the different reasons and rules that the IRS has around 1099s, you should be doing those types of validations on your data as often as you can. And the more data validations you have, you can catch these issues up front and avoid this whole corrections mess and this whole penalty and B-notice mess on the back end. It's also much cheaper and cost effective if you do it up front versus back end processing. So if you do have a system that has good validations, a lot of folks kind of look at 1099s as a yearly process or an annual process. And they wait until January 5th, they get all their data files, they load them into their tax system, and then they frantically, for 10 or 15 days, correct as many issues as they can, and then inevitably what happens is they run out of time. And at that point, they basically just have to click the print button, hope for the best, and deal with the corrections, errors, and penalties that ensue. So it kind of makes for a rough February, March timeframe. So from a best practices standpoint, one of the greatest things you can do to reduce your corrections and penalty exposure is to do those imports more often. So instead of doing them on January 5th, maybe you do them on a quarterly or monthly basis. And what that allows you to do is load your data, validate it against all the rules and validations that you have, or hopefully that you have in place, and work on correcting those issues and errors up front so that when January comes around, you know the state of your data and there's no surprises. You know that you're, maybe only the last month or two of payments do you have to actually do validation and corrections on. And then name and TIN matching. Again, this is, I won't get too in-depth in name and TIN matching, but TIN name matching is something that the IRS provides where you can proactively submit your names and TINs to the IRS, and they'll tell you whether they match and it is, correct according to the IRS records, or if there's a mismatch and you need to actually do something about it. So all the mismatches you have from TIN matching are going to result in a fee notice. If you're doing TIN matching throughout the year, correcting names and TINs, collecting W-9s throughout the year, it's going to make your January process much, much smoother. And then finally, one thing we definitely encourage is metrics and tracking. So as you're going through this corrections process, how are you actually measuring yourself and making sure your team and your organization is getting better? The only way to improve is to know where the issues are. And a great way to do that is every time you make a correction to a 1099, track the reason for that correction. Are they source system errors? Are they import errors? Is it manual keying issues? Is it name TIN issue? If you collect all the reasons that you're making corrections, at the end of the year you can run reports and metrics, figure out the main reasons why the issues exist, and you can actually work with the source systems or individuals who are at that root cause and actually improve the process year over year without actually tracking and correcting the reasons people are calling and the reasons you're making changes. You're never going to get better. So if there's one thing that I can definitely stress about this whole process, it's the metrics and the tracking to improve this process year over year. So just a couple quick takeaways. Make sure that you're filing an extension of time so that you're giving yourself more time to print revised statements. Don't do corrections. Corrections lead to penalties, and IRS exposure, revised forms don't. So file that extension, make changes to forms, but do it before you file them with the IRS. Figure out ways you can provide additional information to your clients to avoid additional calls. This is going to allow actual corrections and issues to get the attention that they deserve versus talking to a bunch of people that just have general questions. So things like print notes, printing transactions, and FAQ documents are great ways to do that. Proactive data validation. Make sure you're validating your data not just in January but throughout the year. Make sure you're taking advantage of things like IRS TIN matching. That's a great thing that you should be doing. And we do have additional webinars that are specific to proactive data validations and cleanup, so be sure to check those out. I think we have at least a couple of them that are 30 minutes or more on that specific topic, so lots of good ideas in those webinars. And then finally, metrics are really vital to this process. Without tracking, there's no way you're going to get better. So with that, I will turn it back over to Lauren.
Great. Thank you, Neil. We do have just a couple of minutes for questions. I do know that it is 2:30 Central Time, so if you do need to drop off, that's just fine. But if you can hang on for a minute, we will go over a couple of questions. One of the most frequently asked questions that we get is if the webinar today has been recorded, and then if they'll be able to get the slides. And the answer to both of those questions is yes. So, and then probably early next week, you'll be getting another email from me that'll provide you a link to the recorded version of this webinar, as well as a handout from today's webinar. First question from our audience is, can an extension of time be requested from the IRS to deliver forms to the recipient?
Great question. You can. There are two different types of extensions that you can file for. The first is for delivery to recipients. That is possible to do. It is a lot harder than the extension for the transmittal to the IRS. So I believe the extension for printing forms is also 30 days, but the process is a lot harder to do. You actually, I believe, have to provide some written communications. And generally, we don't see a lot of organizations do that, but it is an option. The process for filing an extension for transmittals to the IRS is much easier. You just fill out a form online or create a simple electronic document which gets uploaded to the IRS, much like the 1220 transmittal, and it's always granted. I've never seen an organization not be granted an extension of time, and you're not looked upon negatively for doing an extension. So there's really no negatives to filing an extension of times.
How common are IRS penalties for corrections?
So every time you do a correction after you file, you should be getting assessed a penalty that comes on your 972 CEG. So my understanding is that penalties for corrections are very common, and the later in the year, there's actually 3 tiers of penalties. The later in the year that you file corrections, the more the penalty is. So I think previously, if it's within 30 days of your IRS filing, it was $15, it's now $30. If you file corrections before August 1st, the penalty is now $50, and any corrections filed after August 1st of that year are a maximum of $100 per form penalty.
What is the deadline for filing correction transmittals?
So there's not really a deadline per se for filing corrections. If you do have a correction, you do need to file it, whether it's 3 days after you submit your forms to the IRS or a year after you submit your forms to the IRS. So there's not really a deadline. I think once you get to the 3-year mark, it's kind of, I don't quite recall offhand, but generally corrections need to be filed as soon as you're made aware of the correction situation. So there's not really a deadline, but the sooner you get it filed, the less the penalty will be associated with it.
Great, thank you, Neil. In the interest of time, I just want to let everyone know that we have recorded the questions from today's session, and we'll definitely have somebody from Convey follow up with you to get your questions answered. Another couple of resources that Convey offers. One is our 1099 news blog. You can always get up-to-date, most recent changes on our 1099 news blog, and you can even subscribe and get daily updates from our posts. You can follow us on Twitter, and we usually put all of our events on LinkedIn as well. And then last but not least, I did want to just kind of talk briefly about our annual Tax and Regulatory Conference called the C2 Summit. This year it is September 23rd through the 25th at the Omni Dallas Hotel Park West in Dallas. It's 2.5 days of regulatory compliance and kind of Convey solution sessions. You can get a lot more information about the agenda and some of our speakers at c2summit.convey.com. And right now we're offering double early bird discounts. So $400 off a 3-day pass or $300 off a 2-day pass. So again, just visit the website for more information and you can register there as well. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And like I said previously, early next week you will receive an email from me with a link to the recorded version of today's webinar, along with an additional handout. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your afternoon.